Wow. Hey, much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Thanks for tuning in once again. Appreciate you guys taking the time to do that. We're going to go ahead and get into this book here. We're going to get back into the research when it comes to, the crypto Jews, crypto Muslims, and their role in American colonization, the history that really doesn't get told to us in school. But these people played a major role when it came to helping, colonize America. And again, just to remind everybody, and we've gone over this already in many, many videos. If you're new to my channel, if you're new here, these were people of color, melanated people, so-called black people, so-called Negroes. Many of these Jews, so-called Sephardic Jews, we're talking about people from Spain and Portugal. It says here it's called The Jewish Blackness, Theses Revisited. This is from Ron HaKohen from the Department of Literature, Tel Aviv University. This is from 2018. It says here the abstract, the notion that in previous centuries Jews were considered to be black or seen as blacks has gained broad acceptance in scholarly discourse on the Jewish body since the early 1990s. The present article considers the notion analytically and then examines some of the evidence provided to support it. Much of this evidence does not stand critical examination. Therefore, arguably, the notion of Jewish blackness should be reconsidered. The notion of the blackness of the Jews or Jewish blackness has become commonplace in scholarly discourse, going back to the path-breaking work of Sandler L. Gilman in the late 1980s. Scholars often assert that a strong European tradition, dating back to the Middle Ages, maintained that the Jews were black, or at least Swarti, and finds sharp expression in modern anti-Semitic literature. Right, so black and Swarti synonymous. That in medieval literature, a theory prevailed in which the Jews were part of the black race, or were at least dark-skinned. This is from, and it tells you the sources here. Shavit 2001, page 182, or that the general look of the Jew was considered to be like that of the black. The initial formulation is the general consensus of the ethnological literature of the late 19th century was that the Jews were black, or at least Swarti, all right? That was the general consensus. They're letting you know here, all right? Remember that. Jews, what Jews? As the essay continues, however, both the weaker term Swarti and the inverted commas or scare quotes are dropped, and the term used is the blackness of the Jew, and not in a metaphoric sense. The Jews were quite literally seen as black. I'm going to read. The title of the book is called Atlantic Diasporas, Jews, Conversos, and Crypto Jews in the Age of Mercantilism, 1500 to 1800. Edited by Richard L. Kagan and Philip D. Morgan. All right. And so we're going to get into the first chapter of this book. Again, we're just talking about Sephardic Jews. It's not the same as what you think of, people in the Middle East today called Israelis. They are more of Ashkenazi ancestry, sorry. And these people we're talking about are from Spain and Portugal. During the Inquisition, these people had to leave the Iberian Peninsula. And again, most of these people were people of color, so-called black. We're not talking about the so-called white man. All right, again, these Sephardic Jews, conversos, because they had to forcefully convert to Christianity, or, literally get kicked out or get killed. And that's why they became crypto Jews or secret Jews. They still practiced their religion in secret or their faith, but they were outwardly new Christians or conversos. All right. And again, these people were very prosperous when it came to being the merchants and the traders and the ship owners and the port owners in the Americas and in many other parts of the world. So this is what we're going to be talking about again, as you guys see the cover, in the age of mercantilism, from the 1500s to the 1800s. And we go on to chapter 1, and it says Jews and crypto Jews in the Atlantic world system, 1500 to 1800. So every chapter in this book is written by a different person. In this case, we have chapter 1 written by Jonathan Israel. And it says, of the various trading diasporas that played a significant part in the commerce and maritime links of the Atlantic world. During the early modern era, the Sephardic Jewish variant, together with the connected crypto-Jewish element among the descendants of the forcibly baptized Jews, all right, by force, of the Iberian Peninsula, not East Europe, the Iberian Peninsula, surely was the widest ranging in its operations and the longest lasting in its general impact on both culture and society, and on the international trade system. This claim seems to hold whether we consider only stateless diasporas, such as those of the Jews, Huguenots, and Armenians, or also include state-linked diasporas, to use an important distinction and recent discussion about widely flung entrepreneurial trading networks. All right. And remember, the Huguenots are the same people. The Huguenots are ex-Moors or Sephardic Jews that were kicked out of Spain and Portugal. They ended up in southern France and became known as Huguenots, followers of Calvinism, so-called Protestants. Well, a lot of your Protestants are crypto Jews, crypto Muslims. For the Catholic, French, and Genoese merchant communities in early modern Spain and Spanish-America, though certainly examples of this latter category, were unable to operate across confessional lines and function in several different maritime empires simultaneously in the manner the Sephardic diaspora did. It is true that Sephardim and Iberian crypto Jews actually constituted two distinct and in many respects broadly different networks. The former lived in normative Jewish communities in the colonies or homelands of those Western European states, right? Western, not East Europe, principally the Dutch Republic, England, France, that's where you get a lot of Huguenots, and the Italian trading republics that tolerated organized Jewish life. So what they're saying is a lot of them didn't have to go into hiding, because where they eventually ended up, after they got kicked out of Spain and Portugal, they were able to continue being Sephardic Jews. They didn't have to hide. They didn't have to be called crypto Jews, or forcibly convert to Christianity. And in this case, a lot of these people ended up in Holland, in the Dutch Republic, and Amsterdam, which became the New Jerusalem, which they were allowed to continue their faith and their identity as Sephardic Jews. They didn't have to be crypto Jews. So this is what they're trying to break down here, right? The latter, and then now we're talking about the crypto Jews, on the other hand, lived outwardly as Catholics, and mainly, though not only, in Spanish or Portuguese-speaking societies, in which all forms of expression of Jewish allegiance were strictly forbidden. So the ones that were in hiding because they were in places where the Catholics were ruling, they couldn't, be or identify as themselves or what they've been identifying for hundreds of years, their family, their ethnicity as Sephardic Jews or Muslims too. This includes Muslims, right? So they had to go into hiding. They had to pretend they were Christians or so-called Catholics, right? And just be in hiding in these areas because it was strictly forbidding, as it says here. It is also true that those among descendants of medieval Iberian Jewry who continued to adhere to religious practices, attitudes, and family structures associated with crypto-Jewish allegiance and land subject of the crowns of Spain and Portugal were only part and probably a minority of this crypto-Judeo new Christian or converso populations, converts. To complicate matters further, as the years passed, the religiosity of the remaining crypto Jews in the peninsula and equally in Ibero-America, as has recently been shown in masterly fashion by Nathan Wachtel, became progressively more fragmented and syncretist in character. Even so, enduring links between these two different yet connected diasporas persisted. All right, diasporas, because they were forcefully removed from their homeland, Spain and Portugal. A lot of the times, very cruelly, or a lot of times they were able to leave on their own, you know. These links consistent of family ties, religious sympathies, and active trade and collaboration provided a framework for lasting interdependency and interaction between these two diasporas, lending their dual system of networks a flexibility and capacity to cross confessional, political, and cultural divides that, in the transatlantic context, seems to have far surpassed that of any other trading diaspora. If many diasporas can be said to have played a notable part in the development of long distance trade in early modern times, with Greeks, Ashkenazic Jews, there you go, separating them, right? Armenians, Huguenots, and expatriate French and Genoese, all prominent in different zones of the Atlantic world. No other diaspora could match the capacity of the Sephardic Jewish diaspora and its crypto-Jewish counterpart to cut across and link rival empires, trade systems, and confessional blocks throughout the Western Atlantic world, right? Guys, these people were in charge of all the trade. They had all the ports on lock. They were called port Jews. This capacity to link all the seaborne empires, to connect communities across oceans, and to span the Protestant/Catholic divide was unique and as a social phenomenon, clearly not merely commercial but also cross-cultural and political, for it extended beyond the Protestant-Catholic barrier to cross even the yawning gulf between Christianity and Islam, playing an active role over the centuries in Atlantic Morocco, as well as the rest of North Africa and in West Africa, forming ties between the Protestant, Catholic, and Islamic worlds, right? Again, this includes Muslims. It was no less flexible from a political perspective. It may be true that the Sephardim, like other stateless diasporas, were in a weak position politically in relation to host societies, but state-linked diasporas were usually in a still weaker political position when seeking to penetrate the trade orbits of rival states, which were generally less likely to regard stateless diasporas with equivalent political suspicion. In any case, by the late 17th century, by which time there were 6 or 7 European transatlantic seaborne empires, the Spanish, Portuguese, British, French, Dutch, and Danish, the Sephardim conspicuously stood out as the only commercial diaspora that penetrated and remained active for substantial periods, albeit in very varying degrees in all of them. I'm going to read from this book right here real quick, just to corroborate. It says, The Natural History of Man, comprising inquiries into the modifying influence of physical and moral agencies of the different tribes of the human family, by James Cowles Pritchard. All right. And this is volume 1, all the way 1855. And it's about page 131 of this book. And it says here, the Jews have assimilated. All right, we're talking about the Jews, and they're talking about the Jews of Portugal. It says here, the Jews have assimilated in physical characters to the nations among whom they have long resided, though still to be recognized by some minute peculiarities of physiognomy. In the northern countries of Europe, they are fair or sanctuous. Blue eyes and flaxen hair are seen in English Jews, and in some parts of Germany, the red beards of the Jews are very conspicuous. The Jews of Portugal are very dark. The Jews of Portugal are very dark. Again, the Jews of Portugal are very dark. Right? We're going to be talking about the Spaniard and Sephardic Jews of Portugal, and how I'm going to, been letting you know, a lot of these became Huguenots. A lot of these ended up in Holland, the Netherlands, becoming known as Dutch and having influence in the West Indian Company and trade around the world, the ships and everything, and pirates, merchants. Again, these same people we're talking about were very dark-skinned people, so-called Negroes. Atlantic diasporas, Jews, conversos, and crypto Jews in the age of mercantilism, 1500 to 1800. The interaction between Jews of Iberian origin and the Islamic world was indeed far from marginal to the complex process of transition and adaptation that enabled the descendants of a medieval Spanish Jewry, which in the period before 1492, the year of the formal expulsion of openly professing Jews from Spain, had by no means been orientated toward long-distance trade or maritime activity. The Marranos, to develop successful and resilient transatlantic trading networks during the course of the 16th century, about the 1500s. This was especially true during the early stages of the formation of the Western Sephardic diaspora. I have argued elsewhere that it was far from automatic or a foregone conclusion. For instance, that the rise of the Ottoman Empire in the 15th and 16th centuries in the Near East and the Balkans should have created a situation in which Sephardic Jews, rather than other trading diasporas, became the major trading intermediaries between the Ottoman, Near East, and the Christian West, via Venice and other Italian Adriatic ports. In the late 15th century, after the fall of Constantinople to the Turks in 1453, the Venetian, Florentine, and Genoese trading networks in the areas under Turkish control, as well as the flourishing and far-flung Greek and Armenian diasporas, were in many ways seemingly better placed to handle the long-distance commerce of the Ottoman Empire with the West and with Persia and beyond. That the Sephardim succeeded where the others did not was partly the result of Ottoman and Iranian state policy. In the former case, the Ottoman party, moved by political suspicion of Greek and Italian Christians, put obstacles in the path of the Italian merchant colonies, forcing them to rely on local middlemen under Ottoman control. In the latter case, the Shah sought to draw the main Armenian trade networks eastward and away from the Ottoman sphere of influence. But the unique role of the Sephardim was also partly the result of cultural factors. The Sephardic refugees from Spain and Portugal, refugees, who streamed into the Ottoman Empire and settled in particularly large numbers in Salonika, Constantinople, and before long in many lesser places across Greece and the Balkans, because they knew the Western Mediterranean as they did, being Spanish-speaking, easily able to adapt to Italian, and able to read the Latin alphabet, were better equipped to form enduring commercial contacts in the West than were the longer established Greek or Armenian mercantile diasporas emanating from Turkish territory. All right? The setting up shop in these areas, what they're letting you know. Forming these links was achieved by a mix of Sephardim and Marranos, right? Marranos, operating at first especially in Ferrara, Ancona, Florence, and Antwerp, and by the beginning of the 17th century, predominantly in Venice, Livorno, and Amsterdam. So I'm glad they brought this up, these towns in Italy, right? Some of these. Now, Ferrara, that's where you get the last name Ferrari, like the guy who made the automobile. I just recently saw one of the movies they came out with, and I looked it up to see if he might be, Sephardic Jewish. And they don't really admit it, but in the movie, he does say something about, him having some trouble with Hitler, right? And also Ferrara, as it says here, was a very prominent Sephardic Jewish colony in Italy, where these people are coming out of. So Ferrari, most likely are descendants of Sephardic Jews, same ones we're talking about right here. That's why they were very, business-like, the guy who eventually made the cars. A new kind of Sephardic commercial diaspora emerged, focused on importing and exporting through Salonika, Constantinople, and such Dalmatian ports as Valona, Ragusa, and later Spalato. Building on negotiated arrangements and contracts made with several Italian princes and also from the 1580s with the Republic of Venice, and sustaining tenacious but regular links with the crypto Jews in Spain and Portugal, there developed the intricate combination of politics, religion, family connections, shipping arrangements, and trade that made the subsequent remarkable evolution of an enduring transatlantic Sephardic trading diaspora both possible and viable over time. Psychologically, religiously, and culturally, the most delicate and fraught part of this complex process of linking up vastly different religious, political, and cultural zones in the 16th century occurred where the two parts of the dual system of diasporas initially chiefly converged, namely in Italy. From the mid-16th century, as the papacy, backed by the Spanish crown, entered a markedly less tolerant phase, reviving the Roman Inquisition and launching the Counter-Reformation, the position of both those living formerly as Jews and those Iberian merchants in Italy who, listen, as Marranos, Marrano, lived outwardly as Christians. So they were pretending to be Christians, but privately nurtured crypto-Jewish tendencies and contacts. They were really Sephardic Jews or Muslims. Became extremely precarious. More and more restrictions on Jewish life and intellectual activity, combined with an intensifying campaign against the heresy of crypto-Judaism practiced by men who in papal lives were descendants of community validly, even if forcibly baptized in the Iberian Peninsula, most notoriously at Ancona in the 1550s, but also in many other parts of Italy until the 1580s, including Ferrara, right? Ferrara, Pisa, right? Or Pisa, Modena, and Venice. All right, you see these places were hotspots for Sephardic Jews, Muslims who had fled the Inquisition. They ended up in these parts of Italy, guys. As it says here, Marranos, these are people of color suspected of actively Judaizing, were placed under surveillance, investigated, arrested, tried, and sporadically executed in numbers sufficient to exert a heavy psychological toll on the entire community. So these people were being persecuted by the Catholics, not by specific countries, but specifically by the Catholic Empire. A lot of times burned at the stake and things like that, not only in these places, but in the Americas. We might read that in this book. However, by the late 16th and early 17th centuries, Italy was by no means the only point of convergence where ostensible new Christians, all right, so-called new Christians, crypto Jews, living privately as crypto Jews, even if only sporadically, and normative Sephardic Jews speaking the same languages, deriving from the same Iberian background, and often having shared family ties, could renew and intensify their social interaction and commercial collaboration. The same process of interlocking the two expanding diasporas, evident in Italy throughout the 16th century, also developed in the ports of Western France, where Iberian conversos began settling, particularly at Bordeaux and Bayonne, and also in the Low Countries. All right, we've gotten all this before in previous videos, investigations we've done on the Sephardic Jews and the crypto Muslims. I just want to read this book as well now, just to corroborate as well. It says Shakespeare and the Jews. This is the 20th anniversary edition from James Shapiro. All right, scholarly source here. You can dig on it. All right, and we're about on page 171 of this book. And it says here, the accumulated experience of over 100 years of travel, trade, and conquest had convinced Europeans that some of the accepted stereotypes of Jewish racial otherness, including the belief that the Jews were black, needed to be qualified when William Brereton jotted down his impressions of the Jews in the synagogue in Amsterdam in 1635. Amsterdam, again, that's in the Netherlands, Holland, all right? The Dutch, this is the Dutch synagogue, Dutch people, right? Amsterdam,
1635, he's going to let you know that he noted that the Jewish men are most black. They're most black. The Jews. Who was the Jews? Again, who was the Jews that were in Amsterdam? Most of those Jews, all right, had fled from Spain and Portugal. Sephardic Jews who were what? Most black. Remember, the Portuguese were very dark. We already read that. All right, you see the corroboration. And insatiably given unto women, drawing here on contemporary prejudices linking blackness and licentiousness. All right, so then he was talking a little bad about them and says, and when the Scottish minister Robert Kirk toured London in January 1690, he also paid a visit to the synagogue there. Now, this is a whole other different country. Right now, he's in England, now a whole different person, letting you know what he saw when he went in the synagogue, the Jewish synagogue in London, all right, in 1690. He observed over 200 Jews worshiping, 200, all right, 200 people, 200 Jews. He noted in his journal that they were all very black men. Again, Jews worshiping in a synagogue in London. They were what? All very black men. All very black men. Sephardic Jews. Who was in London as a Jew? A lot of these, again, were Sephardic, Moorish Jews from Portugal and Spain. A lot of these were Huguenots, so-called Huguenots, that were actually being able to practice their original religion, which was Jewish, right? Their Jewish religion, Sephardic. He noted in his journal again that they were all very black men. This is in 1690 in London, and indistinct in their reasonings as gypsies. By the end of the 17th century, works like the English translation of Francois Maximilian's Mission, A New Voyage to Italy, make clear that it is a vulgar error that Jews are all black. This Masson observes is only true for the Portuguese Jews. Again, only the Portuguese Jews are black. So when we already got that, this is just another source corroborating that source.
Atlantic diasporas, Jews, conversos, and crypto-Jews in the age of mercantilism, 1500 to 1800. In both the French Atlantic ports and in Amsterdam, the ensuing process of re-Judaization of the Marranos was religiously, psychologically, and culturally complex. It was partly driven by external cultural forces and factors, especially the organized Sephardic Jewish diaspora itself, which provided the rabbis, cantors, teachers, and guidelines, as well as models of communal organization. But it was also driven by the impulse, resisted, however, in many families, of a residual crypto-Judaism transferred chiefly from Portugal, right? Remember what we learned about the Jews from Portugal. They were very dark complexioned. Check out the past videos if you're doubting what I'm saying. We've shown the primary sources and we've shown the genealogy. Frequently via Madrid and northern Spain. During most of the 16th century, both strands of the vibrant and steadily growing Portuguese New Christian community in Antwerp, that is, both the families sincere in their commitment to Catholicism and those inclined to crypto-Judaism, remained largely isolated from any active pool of organized Jewish life. After dynamic Sephardic congregations arose in Amsterdam and Hamburg from the 1590s onward, however, a fairly close interaction between the Antwerp crypto-Jews and Dutch Sephardim became an important nexus in the complex tableau, knitting the two widely radiating diasporas together. All right. So after the Inquisition, these people of color, right, so-called New Christians, are settling all over Europe, especially in these areas they're talking about right here, the so-called Dutch Republic. A lot of these became your so-called Black Dutch, your founders of the East and West Indian companies, right? A lot of the people who, colonized New York or New Amsterdam, right? Your so-called Dutch. That's what I'm trying to show you here. The transfer of this intricate and entwining of networks with all its various social, economic, religious, and political ramifications from the old world to the new, depended on satisfying a number of exacting conditions. In Spain, aside from Mallorca, crypto Judaism barely survived the first few decades after the expulsion of 1492. The great bulk of those who had either previously accepted baptism or who did so in 1492 as an alternative to being expelled, right? So you either had to convert or you had to leave your homeland, right? You've been there for hundreds of years, your whole family, possibly even thousands. And so if you wanted to stay there and not get expelled, kicked out, sent to wherever, even enslaved as indentured servants, you had to convert. That was the alternative. Assimilated, so these people that did stay and convert, they assimilated successfully and fairly rapidly into the Spanish Catholic society. Hence, after around 1530, it was only in Portugal that a relatively large pool of converso population persisted, much of which tended to adhere to crypto-Jewish practices. This community was estimated at around 30,000 to 50,000 persons, or some 3% of the total population of Portugal. The majority consisted of the descendants of those who had left western and central Spain as religious exiles in 1492. The Jews who migrated to Portugal had been forcibly baptized en masse on the orders of the Portuguese king in 1497, but they subsequently suffered a degree of pressure, antipathy, and legalized discrimination that largely obstructed their assimilation into Portuguese society. As a result, they developed a separate caste identity as Cristãos Novos, or New Christians. So much so that subsequently, and rather ironically, this group also proved hard to assimilate in Castile and Spanish America after 1580, when they migrated back into Spain. Consequently, transferred to the New World of an active interaction between Marrano and Sephardic networks required above all a substantial flow of Portuguese converso emigration across the Atlantic. But it also required, given that most of the Spanish Jewish immigrants into Portugal in 1492 had been artisans and petty tradesmen with no mercantile links, a substantial infiltration of the new businesses world of overseas commerce created since the late 15th century, 1400s, right, by the Portuguese crown acting in concert with the major non-Jewish, often Flemish or Italian merchants residing in Lisbon at that time. This penetration needed to occur both within Portugal itself and also throughout the Portuguese overseas mercantile system. All right, just want to read from this book also to corroborate what I'm letting you know, what the general consensus, right? Remember, he was telling us the general consensus during these times. All right, this book is called A System of Geography, or a descriptive, historical, and philosophical view of the several quarters of the world and of the various empires, kingdoms, and republics which they contain, particularly detailing those alterations which have been introduced at the recent revolutions. All right, and it keeps going. And I just wanted you to know this is from 1805. All right, 1805. And we're on page 49 of this book. And it's talking about the Portuguese and the Portuguese Jews and all that. It says, the Jews, that singular people, have been called into the assistance of the advocates for the influence of climate. They are known never to intermarry with any but those of their own sect. And notwithstanding this, it is argued we find them in different parts of the world, of all colors. Jews, what? Jews of all colors. They're come in every color. The English Jew is white. The Portuguese Jew is swarty, so-called black. The Portuguese Jew, swarty, very dark. Portuguese, again, another source. The American Jew, olive. And the Arabian Jew, copper-colored. All right, and remember, we just read, it's not because they mix with Africans. They're not
copper color because they mix with Africans. The Jews say the opposers of this hypothesis undergo under different degrees of heat those changes which every man allows different degrees of heat invariably to produce. All right, so now they're going into the weather, but they're letting us know in this source from 1805. Portuguese Jews, Swarty. Everybody else is very olive or copper colored. It says here only the English Jew is white. That might be an Ashkenazi Jew, maybe not. Who knows? But again, they come in all colors, it says here. In Portuguese, Swarty.
Atlantic diasporas, Jews, conversos, and crypto Jews in the age of mercantilism, 1500 to 1800. The change that provided both the indispensable engine for Portuguese converso entry into maritime mercantile activity in the Old World and the impetus for transfer to the New was the spread of the sugar plantations originally established earlier in the Portuguese Atlantic islands to Sao Tome. That's an island off the coast of West Africa. This was established again by Sephardic Jews and Muslims who had fled the Inquisition. They were your first sugar plantation owners or your sugar planters and growers, guys. Right? We have videos on this, right? We're going to learn more about this. We're going to emphasize. And these, again, were people of color, not the so-called white man. So they established this in the Portuguese Atlantic Islands to Sao Tome, a Portuguese plantation colony off the coast of West Africa. This is a place where they brought a lot of Indians, right, to work in these plantations. And then from the 1560s and on, much larger scale, also to Brazil. These are your first sugar planters in Brazil. While a handful of Portuguese Cristão Novos, or New Christians, had already traded earlier with Brazil, in particular importing Brazil wood, a dyestuff highly prized by the European textile industry, it was unquestionably the advent of Brazilian sugar after 1560 that lent decisive momentum to the forming of a large Portuguese converso maritime trading community. All right, Portuguese conversos, Marranos, people of color, the Brazilian sugar, huh? Equally, this development cemented the relationship between this group, whether domiciled in the Old World or in Brazil. Now, that's the hijack, because America is the Old World. They're just calling it, they're calling Europe and all that the Old World. And the Sephardic diaspora. The Brazil traffic then first generated a relatively large pool of both crypto-Jewish and Sephardic merchants engaged in and orientated toward transatlantic commerce. Meanwhile, a substantial number of Portuguese New Christians reverted to normative Judaism in Morocco. They got to be Jews again when they were in Morocco during the 16th century or the 1500s. And a remarkable and highly complex interaction arose between Jews of Iberian origin domiciled in North Africa, the Sephardic Jewish congregations permitted by the crowns of Spain and Portugal, and several of their North African enclaves, notably Oran, Ceuta, Tangiers, and Melilla. And Portuguese New Christian merchants active in those enclaves who ostensibly remained Catholics. Jews played a quite prominent part in the politics as well as the commerce of Morocco in the 16th and 17th century, and it was there as well as in the Ottoman Empire that they first became involved in the intricacies of both anti and pro-Spanish politics. From the beginning of the 17th century, Dutch influence too became significant in Morocco, with Jews again playing a key intermediary role both commercially and politically. It is striking, for example, that the Saleh corsairs, who had a considerable impact on the sea lanes on both the Atlantic and Mediterranean sides of the Straits of Gibraltar during the century, and who in the early stages of their rise to prominence tended to be particularly hostile to Spain, received their guns, munitions, and gunpowder chiefly from Sephardic Jews in Amsterdam. Come on now. They're the weapons traders. Come on. They're the ones creating the guns, the munitions, and the gunpowder, huh? I'm telling you, these guys were involved in almost every part of trade, guys. These, again, people of color. This is a whole history they leave out. They want you to think these were all so-called white folks. Amsterdam's Sephardic Jews also at this time established a trading network much further south in Senegal, presumably again in part because of the particular advantages they enjoyed operating in a Muslim cultural context, because these were a lot of times the same people. A lot of your so-called Muslims were ex-Sephardic Jews that had converted, and vice versa. We've gone over this information. Remember when the so-called Moors were in control in Spain and Portugal, the Jews lived very prosperous under them. They even helped them take control of the Iberian Peninsula when they came, right? Initially, and what until the 1570s remained primarily a Portuguese transatlantic system, Portuguese-speaking conversos, based in both Portugal and Brazil, played the dominant role, while outwardly observant Sephardic Jews, based at first chiefly in Venice and Pisa, but soon predominantly in Amsterdam, Hamburg, and Livorno, played a growing supplementary part, especially in importing Brazilian sugar to Italy and Northern Europe. These were your sugar merchants. This early pattern was then transformed into a much broader transatlantic system, one in which the two diasporas, crypto-Jewish and Western Sephardic, interacted across a much broader canvas as a result of the union of the two crowns of Spain and Portugal under Philip II in 1580. Although the Portuguese, New Christians, and the Spanish-American viceroyalties were already fairly numerous prior to 1580. After that date, larger numbers of Portuguese conversos arrived, while considerable numbers also began settling, likewise living ostensibly as Catholics. In Spain itself, especially in Madrid, Seville, and other towns of Andalusia. All right. So just real quick, because they mentioned Philip II, I recently did a video on the nun of Moret, right? The black nun who was actually the daughter of King Louis and his wife, right? His wife, Marie Therese, is actually a descendant of this Philip II. I don't know if it's him or his son, but it's one of them. And again, she was most likely a person of color. Philip II, descendant from Charles V, right? A so-called black man. This is what I want you guys to just remember. So I'm not just making all this up, all right? There's a whole history they left out, and the role, people of color, so-called black people, played also in colonizing the Americas, not just the so-called white man. It was especially this latter influence that enabled Portuguese Jewish merchants to enter the official convoy traffic between Spain and Spanish America on an important scale, right? Not a minor, but an important major scale, right? A lot of these people, again, came to the Americas, eventually mixed in with a lot of the Indians. A lot of them, spread their, seed all over the place. A lot of you guys carry this heritage of Sephardic Jews, of Moorish people, who became so-called New Christians or Protestants. And that whole history is forgotten. But a lot of you have this heritage, and this is what I'd be trying to tell you guys. It's more than just Indian. Owing to these new population shifts, then, beginning in the 1580s, crypto-Jewish merchant communities with extensive overseas links became entrenched in the main economic centers of the Spanish-American viceroyalties, especially Mexico City, Lima, right, in Peru, Veracruz, Puebla, Guadalajara, and Cartagena de Indias, right? Cartagena de Indias, that's in Colombia, Carthage of the Indias, and also first became a major presence in the great Andean silver metropolis of Potosi, today in Bolivia. They were mining all that silver in Potosi and using Indians as the slaves, as the miners, right? We've gone over this. The 1580s also saw the beginning of contraband traffic, first introduced by Portuguese New Christians linking Peru via Tucumán in what is now northwest Argentina and the River Plate route, the River Plate, right? River Plate with Buenos Aires. and the Portuguese outposts in southern Brazil. Many of the new arrivals, especially among the men, arrived on Portuguese slaving vessels that reached Spanish America via Angola. Now, I just want to say something because they're starting off from here, but Angola was actually started and colonized by Portuguese, by Brazilians, right? But Brazilian, I'm not just gonna say Portuguese, but by Brazilians. Brazilians were the first to go into Angola, right? A lot of these are Sephardic Jews. A lot of these Brazilians had Indian blood already. They had mixed and they had gone and colonized Portugal. They had brought a lot of the Tupi people, a lot of Indians to work over there as slaves first before, as they're saying here, returning, coming back on these so-called slaving vessels, right? They're the ones who own these slaving vessels. A major factor facilitating this transfer of Portuguese new Christians to Spanish America was the policy of the Spanish crown during the period of the Union of Two Crowns, 1580 to 1640, to import so-called black slaves to Spanish American colonies exclusively on Portuguese vessels sailing from West Africa, furnished with special licenses to enter Spanish American ports. Now, I want to just go ahead and speak on the context with this. Again, the same people they're saying, right? These Portuguese Jews are so-called black. So they're importing people. And a lot of the times when they say importing from West Africa, they're not talking about from the mainland. They're not talking about from the mainland. They're doing trade there. They're not. I have a whole book on the West African colonization by the Portuguese, right? And I don't talk about anything about them enslaving millions of people. A lot of these so-called slaves were being brought from Cape Verde. That was one of their colonies, and Saint Thomas. That's about it. And it's very little, guys. They were actually, we already know. Check out my video, The Real Slave Trade, right? Part 1. These people were heavily enslaving the local populations, the Indians. That's what they're not telling you. They're not telling you the route of these ships. They're not telling you, oh, yeah, they went here first, the Caribbean, or they came from the north, and then they went into Brazil. They're not telling you the whole route. They're not telling you the whole context. They're still going. This book is from 2009, so they're still going with the, false narrative of the West African slave trade to America, right? I just want to break that down. If you doubt what I'm saying, you're new, you're getting frustrated because you think I'm trying to hide this history, we already debunked that. Catch up on the video so you guys can see what I'm talking about. This system simultaneously expanded the scale of the slave trade to Spanish America and tightened the economic links between the hitherto largely separate maritime trading empires of Portugal and Spain, while also encouraging the further development of illicit forms of trade in valuable commodities in exchange for bullion between Lisbon and the Spanish colonies between Lisbon, Portugal. This smuggling traffic was carried on both by means of the Portuguese slaving vessels and the Tucumán contraband route linking Potosi to Brazil, whence goods returned on the sugar ships to Lisbon and Oporto, right? Goods meaning also people. When they talk about these commodities, this is what they're leaving out. They were enslaving many American Indians and bringing them to Lisbon and Oporto and to West Africa. The success of Portuguese New Christian merchants, brokers, itinerant traders, and maritime agents in establishing viable trading networks that spanned vast distances in the New World clearly owed much to the immigrants' common Portuguese Marrano, religious, and cultural background, as well as the maritime opportunities opened by the 16th century Portuguese maritime expansion. But structurally and psychologically, the religious, ethnic, commercial diaspora that actually came to span the Atlantic world after 1580 required considerably more than this. Research on the Portuguese conversos who migrated to Mexico, and especially new research on the crypto-Jewish community of Cartagena de Indias, right, in Colombia, and New Granada, as it says here today, Colombia, New Granada, right, Granada, the pomegranate, Granada, reveals the crucial importance of both Seville and Madrid as cultural, political, and economic bridges. These great international metropolises and imperial melting pots enabled the recent immigrants from Portugal simultaneously to consolidate their veiled crypto-Jewish culture while adapting to the institutions, requisites, and exigencies of life in a wider Spanish-speaking imperium and mercantile milieu. In this way, family networks, often originated in particular districts, notably around Castelo Branco and the Beira district of east central Portugal near the Spanish frontier, came to form a novel kind of close knit but flexible crypto Jewish trading and marriage system, one that was simultaneously inward looking and yet superbly adjusted to organize family trading networks in the New World. At the same time, it was adept at connecting with both the crypto Jewish and the Sephardic communities settled in France, Italy, and the Low Countries. Remarkably, several of the families that congregated in Seville subsequently regularly intermarried, perpetuating a pattern already fixed earlier in Castelo Branco, continuing to remain closely linked through marriage as well as trade for generations, not only in Spain but also long after emigrating to New Granada and Colombia, right, Peru, and New Spain, which is Mexico and a lot of Florida, the Southwest US, even the East Coast, Central America, East Coast of US. That was New Spain. Such networks proved effective and enduring over vast distances because of the high degree of group solidarity characteristic of the Portuguese New Christian caste, an advantage acquired, however, at a high price, being in large part a consequence of shared feelings of estrangement, rejection, and persecution. All right, so these people literally stayed together, they unified, whether they disagreed on certain things, they knew that they were all Sephardic Jews or Muslims. They had been kicked out of Spain and Portugal, so they had a close knit, and they controlled all the trade in the Atlantic. Until the major Inquisition onslaught of the 1640s, which effectively broke the back of Portuguese crypto-Judaism in the main commercial centers of the Spanish Indies, sporadic outbursts of harassment and persecution certainly led to the imprisonment and execution of a sufficient number of new Christians to drive some sections of this community to diffuse still further into the Spanish American interior. Nonetheless, these remarkable transatlantic social networks were neither altogether suppressed nor was their activity wholly disrupted. As a result, crypto Jewish cells were established in several extremely remote regions, including Tucumán and the small ports of western Venezuela. Another instance of this phenomenon was the migration of crypto Jews at the beginning of the 17th century into New Mexico. All right, these are all future videos. We're going to break down these people, who they became, what happened in these areas of the world. All right, and you're going to see that a lot of them became people of color and founders of a lot of towns in the Southwest and the Western US, California and all that. You guys will see an area that had very little commercial importance, but where Portuguese Marranos were largely, albeit not entirely safe from the attentions of the Inquisition. All right, I'm going to read from this book real quick. It says Jews and Blacks in the Early Modern World by Jonathan Scorch. All right, Jews and Blacks. This is the cover. So on page 181, we start out with the same reference we read about earlier. Not all Jewish are blacks. It's vulgar to say that. Only the Portuguese are the ones, right? It says it here again. But down here it says, towards the latter end of the 18th century, one finds the same changeability of Jews expressed in updated nuances in geographic context. The Reverend Samuel Stanhope Smith wrote that the Jews are fair in Britain and Germany, brown in France. The Jews are what? They're brown skin. They're brown in France, French, Huguenots, and in Turkey, Swarti, in Portugal. So brown in France and Turkey, and Swarti, or so-called black, in Portugal and Spain. They're black in Portugal and Spain. The Jews are black in Portugal and Spain. Swarti, black. Olive in Syria and in Chaldea. Tawny or copper-colored in Arabia and Egypt. All right, so different shades, all right, of complexion, the Jews. All right, again, another source here. All right, so further down in this book, all right, I want to read this part.
It says, while such views may be passed off as mere descriptive statements about the darkness of Sephardic Jews, the darkness of Sephardic Jews. Sephardic Jews are what? So-called black. They have dark skin. Remember that the Jews of Portugal and Spain, which are the Sephardic Jews, all right, are so-called black. We already got a lot of references, different books. They soon connected intimately with prescriptive notions based on the significance of physiological or racial characteristics. Thus, in 1750, petition from Kingston, Jamaica, Christians objecting to a recent attempt by Jewish landowner to vote, presented the following argument. It says, though a mulatto of the fourth descent may vote at elections, yet the Jews, many of whom are mulattoes of that degree, are by our wise legislation absolutely excluded from that privilege, it being expressly enacted that they, said mulattoes, should enjoy all the privileges and honors. So that's something that was being written in 1720 from Kingston, Jamaica about them. It says, note the lack of stability in the Jews' color and the overlap of cultural and physiological otherness. Many of the Jews were mulattoes of the fourth degree, that is, very light-skinned blacks. Jews, light-skinned blacks, and hence should have been permitted to vote. But Jews were not Christians. Unlike mulattoes, the religious exclusion of Jews put them on the level of mulattoes and blacks. Jews both were and were not blacks, were and were not whites. These various views of Jews branded them in David Rodiger's terminology as not yet white. The Jewish gaze outward ramified significantly on internal perceptions as well. The effort to clarify the blackness of Jews helped shape some seminal moments in the development of Jewish ethnography.
Atlantic diasporas, Jews, conversos, and crypto-Jews in the age of mercantilism, 1500 to 1800. Spain's Atlantic primacy was increasingly compromised from the end of the 16th century. But if the Spanish Atlantic imperial system progressively weakened after 1600, and with it the commerce of Madrid, Mexico City, Lima, and Seville, the expansion of Dutch and later English and French trade and colonization in the Caribbean area, the Guyanas, and northern Brazil from 1624 to 1645 created fresh possibilities for commercial interaction between Portuguese crypto-Jewish networks entrenched in the New World and normative Sephardic congregations in Europe. Spanish officials in Spain and in the New World were acutely conscious of this growing cooperation, and their earliest suspicion of the Portuguese new Christians as religious betrayers and heretics now came to be tinged by an additional element: fear of political subversion. For not only were more and more new Christians migrating from Portugal and Spain to Holland, Hamburg, France, and Italy, where they reverted to normative Judaism, but a sufficient number of re-Judaized Sephardim re-entered the Iberian empires to reinforce the crypto-Jewish tendency in the American viceroyalties, a process that has been documented in some detail for Mexico. It is certain that a process regarded by the Inquisition as religious subversion was taking place, and it is scarcely open to doubt that this religious subversion also carried with it an element of political subversion. No doubt the reality was considerably more prosaic than the lurid picture conjured up by the more paranoid inquisitors and administrators. No doubt the accusations at the time of the Dutch capture of Bahia in 1624 that the Portuguese New Christians were political as well as religious traitors colluding with the Dutch were exaggerated. Nevertheless, the already deep suspicion of the Portuguese intensified, and there is little doubt that some converso merchants in New Spain and at Cartagena did have direct links with Holland and some service contacts with the Dutch West India Company. All right, again, there's a whole background we've gone over when there's talking about all these people. They're all kind of all the same in families. They're all, a lot of them, Sephardic Jews, Muslim Moors, Also, the owners of the West India Company, the founders are actually, a lot of them were Sephardic Jews. Again, people of color. Before 1620, Dutch interloping in the Americas tended to be concentrated along the coast of Santo Domingo, Cuba, and western Venezuela, where there were many sheltered inlets and remote bays highly suitable for smuggling. These same regions also produced a high-quality tobacco, Cracas tobacco, much sought after that time in Holland. By contrast, between 1620 and the early 1650s, the main focus of Dutch enterprise was in northern Brazil, where at Recife, the first organized Sephardic community in the New World took shape in the 1630s, and where at least some local New Christians are known to have reverted to normative Judaism. Meanwhile, the Inquisition onslaught of the late 1630s in Peru and in the 1640s in New Spain and New Granada so drastically weakened the crypto-Jewish networks in Ibero-America that from the 1640s onward, the balance in commercial importance shifted markedly and irreversibly toward the organized Sephardic communities in the New World, which in the 1640s began to spread also to Barbados and other parts of the Caribbean. At the same time, the political secession of Portugal from the Spanish Empire in 1640, followed by that of Brazil a year later, and the long and bitter war between Spain and Portugal, which ensued, lasting down to 1668, caused the fragmentation of hitherto relatively coherent networks of Portuguese conversos, links extending across the Atlantic world. In particular, the Portuguese succession, which was immediately followed by a ban imposed by the Spanish crown on the entry of Portuguese shipping into Spanish and Spanish-American ports, badly disrupted ties between the Portuguese New Christian merchants resident in Portugal and Brazil and the Portuguese crypto-Jewish networks in New Spain, New Granada, Venezuela, and Peru, virtually putting a complete stop to the Portuguese slave trade to the Spanish-American dependencies. The contraband route linking Peru with Brazil via the River Plate and Buenos Aires was also largely disrupted. The reemergence of Portugal as an Atlantic power in her own right split the Marrano communities of the Iberian world into two groups with contrary political allegiances, a tension noticeable even among different groups of Sephardic families and individuals trading with Spain and Portugal, resident in Holland and at Hamburg. This situation was further convoluted, when the Dutch Republic, which in the early 1640s had been aligned with Portugal and remained fiercely hostile to Spain, veered round toward alignment with Spain and hostility to Portugal following the Great Revolt of the Catholic Portuguese planters in northern Brazil against the Dutch and Dutch Jews in 1645 and the Dutch-Spanish Peace of 1648. Portugal, from the 1650s onward, settled more and more into close political, strategic, and economic relations with England. After the final loss of their Brazilian territory in 1654, at the end of the First Anglo-Dutch War, 1652 to 54, the Dutch switched their chief effort in the New World to building up their base at Curaçao as a general Caribbean slaving and commercial depot and establishing organized trade networks radiating from Curaçao across the Caribbean and via western Venezuela to Bogota in Colombia, Quito in Ecuador and Peru. In this way, from the 1660s onward, a new system of transatlantic commerce emerged in which the Sephardim at Amsterdam and Curaçao acted as crucial intermediaries, all right? And again, if you go back to my older videos and research on the Sephardic Jews we've gone over, their whole trajectory, where they went, where they colonized, where they migrated to in the Caribbean, as they're saying here, Curaçao, their role there, and then how they went from there into North America. At the height of its prosperity, at the end of the 17th century, Curaçao boasted a fleet of some 80 barks and sloops, a substantial proportion owned by Sephardic Jews. At the same time, from 1667, when they captured Suriname from the English, the Dutch established a flourishing new sugar plantation economy in the Guyanas, which to some extent replaced the rich source of sugar they had lost in northern Brazil. The substantial Sephardic community that established itself in Suriname, all right, emigrated in part from other parts of the New World, in part from Holland, and in part from elsewhere in the Old World. The various normative Sephardic congregations that took root in the New World during the third quarter of the 17th century at Curaçao, all right, Barbados, Jodin, Savannah or Suriname, St. Thomas, St. Eustatius, New Amsterdam, right, New York, right, after 1664, New York, and Jamaica, right, we have videos on all this, who's the real pirates of the Caribbean, all that, were all orientated chiefly toward Amsterdam, though the Jews settling in those places, like their predecessors in Dutch Brazil, in the second quarter of the century, also had close ties with the Sephardic congregations in Italy, France, Hamburg, and from the 1650s, London, all right? Again, we're just talking about people of color in these areas of the world and the New World and the Caribbean. The largest of the synagogues, Mikveh Israel on Curaçao, constructed in the years 1730 to 32 to replace an earlier and smaller structure, a rather grand edifice still surviving today, remained the largest synagogue building in the Western Hemisphere down to the 19th century and long continued to serve as the religious, cultural, and commercial headquarters of the Jewish Caribbean, right, in Curaçao. The rapid expansion of English power, right? We're talking about Catholics when they're saying English, because a lot of the so-called English were also crypto Jews, Sephardic Jews, and crypto Muslims, right? We've gone over this. So again, the rapid expansion of English power or the Catholics and overseas trade during the Cromwellian period, and the rise of the Sephardic community in London, as well as the parliamentary expedition of 1651, which largely eliminated Dutch influence, along with the English royalists from Barbados, certainly enabled England and the Sephardim in London, right? They're there as well, to create a second network of transatlantic links that was, from the outset, a formidable rival to the Dutch and Dutch Sephardic commercial system based on Amsterdam, Curaçao, and the Dutch West India Company's fragile but for the most continued domination of the slaving and trading depots in West Africa. All right, they're going over there. That's the thing. They tell this in reverse. When they're establishing trade over there, they're literally just trading. They're not taking people by the millions. We got a whole book. We got a whole research on that. There is no real primary sources letting you know of them grabbing millions of people from over there. And remember, these people are so-called black. Undoubtedly, by the late 17th century, both England and France had outstripped the Dutch Republic as naval powers, and both at the time possessed larger complexes of sugar plantation colonies. Nevertheless, down to the end of the Habsburg period in Spain and Spanish-America, and the onset of the War of the Spanish Succession, 1702 to 1713, the Dutch continued to have more trade with Spanish-America and better access to the remaining interior trade routes and crypto-Jewish networks, particularly in Andean South America. The main reason for this is that the Spanish crown, after 1663, preferred to organize the purchase of black slaves for the Spanish-American colonies via the Dutch West India Company and the Curaçao Entrepot, right? Again, these so-called black slaves includes literally American Indians and black Europeans, guys, rather than allow slaves to be shipped to Spanish America by the English or French, both of whom represented a much greater strategic threat to Spanish interests in the New World than did the Dutch. Much of the trade in commodities other than slaves then tended to follow in the wake of the slave trade, being largely plied by the same ships and along the same routes. Nevertheless, the rapid growth of English trade with Portugal, Brazil, and the Caribbean, as well as West Africa, and from the 1660s also of French Caribbean and West African commerce, fundamentally altered the character of the Atlantic world. Even parts of the Spanish Atlantic system were now coming under growing English domination, so-called English. A notable example of this shift in the balance of maritime and economic power in an area where the active participation of both the crypto-Jewish and Sephardic diasporas as intermediaries remained important was the commerce of the Canary Islands. Here the main export in the 17th century was wine, whose principal market was England, although Portuguese New Christian merchants resident in the Canaries and active in the Canary wine trade also had regular trading and secret religious links with their Sephardim in Holland. All right. After the First Anglo-Dutch War, 1652 to 54, their orientation was increasingly toward London. A key asset enabling the Dutch to shore up their ascendancy in the contraband trade with Spanish America for a time down to the first decade of the 18th century was the unofficial settlement, or rather commercial staging post, which they established around 1693 at Tucacas on the remote promontory of Paraguana and the extreme northwest of Venezuela. With the use of this depot, supplied from nearby Curaçao, the Dutch and the Curaçao Sephardim were able to expand their exporting of spices, brandy, linen, paper, and slaves to Coro, Maracaibo, Rio de la Hacha, and points further west in New Granada and beyond. Jacob Señor, alias Felipe Enriquez, from 1660 to 1718, for instance, a Sephardic ship owner, right? These were your ship owners, these were your merchants who spent long periods on the Venezuelan mainland and was among those most active in developing the Tucacas entrepot trade. Around 1700, received most of the goods he sent there from a leading Sephardic exporter of Amsterdam named Abraham Fundao, right? They had connections and networks going back and forth, right? This is what I was explaining. This is what we've gone over before. During the course of the 18th century, several different trends and processes converged to weaken further the role of both the Sephardic diaspora and the remnants of the crypto-Jewish diaspora. A notable setback for both groups was the sharp reaction in Bourbon, Spain, in the years after 1716 against the Portuguese New Christian merchant community of Madrid and Seville and their Sephardic contacts, which had tended to side with the anti-Bourbon forces and their British and Dutch allies during the War of the Spanish Succession. But a still more important general factor undermining the importance of the Marrano and Sephardic diasporas in the Atlantic system was the growing ascendancy of Britain in Atlantic trade and in the transatlantic slave trade and of the North American colonies as a maritime mercantile bloc in their own right. Sephardic and converso networks were far less important to the commerce of the British Empire and the ports of British North America than these had been to the empires of the Portuguese, Spanish, Venetians, and Dutch. At the same time, the London Sephardic congregation and those of New York and Newport, Rhode Island, tended to become religiously and culturally, as well as economically, more distant and independent from that of Amsterdam, which tended to weaken the unity and cohesion of the Western Sephardic diaspora itself, right? So these congregations were New York and Newport and Rhode Island, huh? Yet another significant factor was the growing role of France, which captured and retained a large share of both the Caribbean sugar trade and the slave trade during the 18th century, right? So again, so-called French, so-called English, so-called Dutch, a lot of them includes these people. So they captured, so here comes France in the 18th century, right? For the French crown following Louis XIV, a so-called black man, right? Louis XIV, a so-called black man, expulsion of the Jews Black on black war, more on more war. Shout out to Drop. So he expelled the Jews from the French Caribbean islands in 1685, when nearly 100 Sephardim were expelled from Martinique alone, right? Most migrating to Curacao, went to some lengths to prevent the reestablishment of formal Sephardic congregations on French territory in the New World. Despite the continuing extensive participation of the Sephardic communities of Bordeaux and Bayonne in all aspects of French Atlantic trade. All right. So remember, Louis XIV, so-called black man, he was Catholic. He was part of the Catholic Empire, right? So this is religious wars, not just countries versus other countries. Communal relations between the Sephardic congregations in Holland and those in France remained close after 1713. But whereas migration had earlier flowed mainly from France to Amsterdam, the greatly weakened position of the Dutch trading system, especially after around 1740, tended to reverse the trend, prompting Sephardic immigration from Holland to the French ports, as well as London, New York, and the British Caribbean. Meanwhile, the relatively large number of Inquisition investigations of accused Judaizers in the northeast of Brazil during the second quarter of the 18th century, as well as the persistence of crypto-Jewish practices in New Granada, New Mexico, and doubtless other places shows that Ibero-American crypto-Judaism was far from dead. There was also still at least some Sephardim born into communities where their religion could be freely practiced, who gravitated to Ibero-America, as they did also to the 18th century Spain. One of the last conversos to be burned by the Inquisition in Spanish-America was Fernando de Medina, right, alias Moises Gomez, a native of Bordeaux, executed at a small auto de fe in Mexico City in June 1699. But the evidence also shows that a steady process of attenuation, assimilation, and religious and cultural dilution was taking place, which, though doubtless temporarily arrested or delayed by the presence of the Dutch and Dutch Sephardim in Brazil between 1630 and 1654, and along the coast of Venezuela and New Granada in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, nevertheless, in the lower run, continued inexorably. In the longer run, continued inexorably. By the second half of the 18th century, there was no longer any question of a meaningful, organized social and commercial interaction between the crypto-Jewish remnants in Ibero-America and the Western Sephardic diaspora. The French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars in any case destroyed the remaining mercantile importance of Amsterdam in the New World, and with it eliminated the last shreds of what had once been an imposing transatlantic long-distance network of social, religious, and commercial interaction, one that cut across the boundaries of the all and the European transatlantic maritime empires. Even so, it was not only the fairly numerous organized Sephardic congregations of the Caribbean and the North American East Coast which continued to bear witness to the history of a truly remarkable transatlantic phenomenon. There were still hidden outposts of a residual crypto-Jewish presence in regions as diverse as Brazil, New Mexico, and Venezuela, some of which were only rediscovered by those interested in such vestiges during the course of the 20th century. All right. And that's the end of this chapter, guys, and this book. Again, book we were reading, Atlantic Diasporas, Jews and Conversos, and Crypto-Jews in the Age of Mercantilism from 1500 to 1800. All right. We just read chapter 1. I hope you guys enjoyed the reading. We're going to try to get back into this research. I haven't done one of these videos in a while. But again, I know what I'm trying to point out here, guys, is their role. It had a major role when it came to the trade, the Atlantic trade in colonial times. And again, biggest point is that these are people of color. These aren't the so-called white man, and they were involved in trade in West Africa, but they didn't bring slaves from over there. They It was the other way around. And these people were enslaving American Indians and the European indentured servants, the unwanteds that were, being kicked out of Europe because these were the ship owners. So they would indenture these people. They were the ones who owned or brought these people the real Middle Passage, right? Back and forth. All right, so guys, before I go today, just for the dismount, we're gonna get 10 pages. These chapters are short. This is another book. I bought this on Google Play Books, and it's called The Jewish Nation of the Caribbean, the Spanish-Portuguese Jewish settlements in the Caribbean and the Guyanas, all right? We're not talking about Ashkenazi or Israelis. We're talking about the ones from the Iberian Peninsula, okay? This is from Mordecai Arbel. And we're going to go to chapter 1 of this book, and it's called The Jews of Martinique and Guadeloupe. We just read, how King Louis got rid of all the so-called expelled the Sephardic Jews from these islands. And it says here, the Jewish history of Martinique and Guadeloupe is relatively short, spanning only about 60 years. It began with the first arrivals from Amsterdam, right? From Amsterdam in the 1620s, who came to manage Dutch interests and Dutch commercial outposts established on the island and continued until the expulsion of the Jews in 1685. Although short-lived, the Jewish presence had an important impact on life in those two islands. It brought important changes in their economic structure, while at the same time causing strains in the relations between lay rulers of the island and their Catholic establishment. In 1635, Cardinal Richelieu founded the Compagnie des Isles d'Amérique, the Company of the Islands of America, with the intention of developing production of tropical plants and their commerce. He saw in the West Indies a source of income for the French crown and state. The establishment of the company encountered fierce opposition from the settlers and planters already there. The company regulations dictated the collection of commission and taxes at the rate of 20% of sales and the levying of important tax on goods entering France, with general preference being given to import and export to France. The company's establishment coincided with the 1635 occupation of Martinique on the behalf of France by Pierre Belin de Esnambuc. This situation resulted from his successful landing and occupation of the island of St. Christopher or St. Kitts in 1625, and his agreement to divide the island into two with the British, along with initiating the development of tobacco, raisin, and indigo production. This led to the founding of the French St. Christopher Company. The capture for France of the island of Guadeloupe by Jean du Plessis, Sieur de Aussenville, in 1635 raised hopes in France for large-scale development and income from its island possessions on the American continent. The hopes did not materialize. The principal product, tobacco, was usually sold in non-French markets, thus depriving France of taxes. Tobacco prices in world markets dropped lower and lower. The Company of the Islands of America was losing money. In 1649, the company was forced to sell its rights to private owners, seigneurs, who would rule the island according to French version of the English and Dutch patronships. In 1649, the islands of Guadeloupe and Marie Galante were purchased by the Huel family. In Martinique, St. Lucia, Grenada, and the Grenadines by Monsieur Diel du Parquet, a nephew of de Esnambuc. Upon the French occupation of Martinique in 1635, they found a number of Jews there who had arrived earlier from Amsterdam. They were there first to serve as agents and managers for Dutch enterprises established on the islands. The Dominican monk Jean-Baptiste du Tertre, who arrived in Martinique in 1640, and remained there for 16 years, described a fire in which 60 Dutch warehouses were consumed, which shows that Dutch presence on the island was considerable. The French did not disturb the resident Dutch Jews, whose number was not significant. They were dispersed among the warehouses, plantations, and stores all over the island, and as far as is known, did not form a community. The Jews were able to work and prosper under 20 years of French rule, tolerated and protected by the French governors, who needed their commercial and financial acumen and whose services they used. All right, so this is something that happened a lot. They needed a lot of these Catholic overseers, because they were the ones, ruling. They used the Sephardic Jews and the Muslims for their trade connections and their skills in business and their skills in the plantations and growing these things until they had no more use for them. We read that a lot already in past researches, but as it says here, they tolerated them, right, for their commercial and financial acumens. Gradually, the Jews' success aroused the jealousy of the French settlers and merchants. At the same time, the growing number of Catholic monks and priests arriving in the colony could not bear to see Jews residing in French-ruled territories. The Jewish presence in Martinique changed dramatically with the Portuguese occupation of Dutch Brazil. The ships loaded with Jews, Dutch settlers, and other Protestants, right? I told you it's all the same people, roamed the Caribbean Sea seeking possibilities for settlement. The monk Duterte describes the arrival of refugees from Brazil as follows. A ship of 1,400 tons sailed toward our islands, reached Martinique at the beginning of 1654. Its chiefs disembarked and came to present their homage to M. du Parquet and to ask him to agree to their settling in his island on the same terms and conditions as the French settlers. M. du Parquet was well disposed and gave some promises, but the Reverend Jesuit fathers, right, Catholics, declared to him that this was against the intention of the king and that the introduction of these people, again, who are Sephardic Jews and Muslim Moors, right, crypto Jews, into the island, of which the majority were Jews and other heretics, right? That's what they call them, heretics, will introduce heresy and Judaism, and they managed to convince him. He decided with sorrow to reject them in the politest way possible. When the governor of Guadeloupe, M. Huel, learned of the refusal to allow refugees to land in Martinique, he hoped they would arrive in Guadeloupe. Duterte details for us the arrival of the refugees. A big ship full of inhabitants of the island of Tamarica, right? Amarica, Tamarica, right? This was the name of that region. Again, that was not named after Vespucci or Albert Vespucci, right? That was the name that was already locally there. We got the whole breakdown on the origin of the name America. Again, the ancient name of Egypt is Tamarica, all right? So a lot of Jews coming out of that region, Sephardic Jews and Muslim, crypto Jews, crypto Muslims coming in from that region on the island of Tamarica, Brazil, and their slaves, Indians, are anchored at the island, and 4 chiefs of the vessel came to ask his permission to reside in his island with their families, their slaves, on the same conditions as the other inhabitants. M. Huel received them well, accepted their request with great joy. Other ships came to the next night. 1 Dutch frigate, the same day. 2 other big ships arrived with inhabitants of Paraiba, Brazil, and the next Wednesday, a big ship with the garrison of Tamarica and Paraiba. In his description, Duterte relates that the refugees from Brazil, refugees whose number he estimated was about 900 free men and slaves, came with a great deal of property. The impression in Guadeloupe was that once they landed, these refugees from Brazil would spend lots of gold and silver in purchases in order to install themselves. The governor of Martinique, du Parquet, saw that he was losing a rare opportunity of making profits and that all the new settlers are landing in Guadeloupe. He expressed his anger to the Jesuit fathers. This forced the Jesuit superior to travel to Guadeloupe in order to convince Huel to expel the strangers from Brazil. Duterte says that Huel told the superior to mind his own business. Jews and Dutch settled in Guadeloupe. In a short while, another ship of refugees arrived in Martinique with 300 Dutch and Jews, all the same people. M. du Parquet received them, this time with open arms. It is quite clear from different sources and documents that according to the terms of surrender between the Dutch and the Portuguese in Brazil, the Dutch and the Jews could leave Brazil with their movable property, their money, and their slaves. Therefore, the Jews arriving in Martinique and Guadeloupe had property with them. There was one exception. A group that traveled from Brazil on board the frigate Falcon Vault with the destination of Martinique was forced, due to a storm and adverse winds, to anchor in Jamaica. We've gone over this story before. At that time, Jamaica was still a Spanish colony. The Spanish governor stopped the ship and arrested those passengers who were conversos and had returned to Judaism, therefore liable to punishment by the Spanish Inquisition. All right, when they say in Spanish here, they're talking about the Catholics who were in control of Jamaica at that time. But remember, the Sephardic Jews, the so-called Dutch, a lot of these people were already they were Spanish themselves. They were Jews from Spain and Portugal, right? So don't get that mixed up. This is what I'm trying to explain to you earlier, that it's not just countries versus other countries. It's a religious war. Spanish Catholics versus Spanish so-called Jews too, all right? People from their own country. The others who were Dutch or people who were born Jews, like I was saying, right? These Dutch are the same. It's just other Sephardic Jews. They were born so-called Jews, Sephardic Jews, therefore not accused of heresy, were led to find their way on, all right? So the ones who were literally crypto Jews or hiding that they were Jewish, they were allowed. The rest of them weren't. According to the historian Arnold Wittnitzer, they found the ship Santa Catherine and finally found their way to New Amsterdam. That's New York, right? So these people eventually, they didn't get allowed to go to Jamaica. Where did they go? They ended up in New York, all right? These are people of color, right? They went to New Amsterdam, New York. According to him, on board were 23 Jews who founded the first Jewish community of New York, all right? We got already a lot of research on that. All right, check out my previous videos. Wittnitzer theory has been disputed and other variations exist. However, it is not the subject of this book, all right? It's not a theory. They literally went up there from the Caribbean, guys. Those that were detained were subject to an official Dutch intervention in Spain, claiming that they are Dutch citizens and that the Spanish Inquisition should not be allowed to deal with them, and they should be released. In the orders from Spain to the Spanish governor, he had to release them for the sake of good relations with Holland. By that time, the group of Jews was almost penniless and part of their property confiscated by the Spanish governor. The Falcon proceeded to Martinique. As for the slaves, it is interesting to note the observation of Duterte that the Dutch and Jews brought with them two kinds of Brazilian savages. Listen, Brazilian savages, American Indians. One group contained Christians, and they were slaves, right? Christians who were slaves. I told you they were enslaving Europeans and American Indians. One group contained Christians, and they were slaves. The other group had pagans, and they were freemen. The term savages was generally used in those times for Indians, okay? For Indians. No mention of Africans, right? As far as we can follow the history of the Jewish settlements in the Caribbean and the Guyana, in many places the authorities, British, Dutch, or French, would generally not permit Jews to have Christian servants or slaves, right? Christian servants. Again, who are they using? Europeans and American Indians as slaves, not Africans. In some instances, the Jews were even accused of opposing baptism, to those who were in their service. Therefore, it can be deduced that the pagans were servants of the Jews and were treated as free men. As for the Negroes, in the words of Duterte, those who came with the refugees from Brazil were free to work on Saturdays for their own income and receive plots of land from their masters on which they cultivated potatoes and manioc they then sold on the free market, generating personal income. Again, Indians and Europeans. It is quite clear that the above description refers to the workers of the Jewish planters who would not work on Saturdays. The people who worked for them were free to tend their own business on that day. The permission given to Jews to settle in Martinique and Guadeloupe attracted some French Jews of Spanish-Portuguese origin from Bayonne and Bordeaux, most often related to those who had come from Brazil. All right, related. French Jews, listen, this is what I was saying, they're all the same. Related to the ones coming from Brazil, increasing the number of Jews in the French islands. It is difficult to evaluate the exact number of Jews in Martinique and Guadeloupe in 1658. A conservative estimate might be about 300 among a population of about 5,000 whites. Oh, wait a minute. So are they separating Jews between the whites? But, the numbers are a lot more. We've gone over the numbers in previous investigations. A lot of these people they're calling whites or non-Jews are already people who are crypto Jews, hiding as Catholics, hiding as so-called French, hiding as whatever other denomination, but they're crypto Jews or crypto Muslims. The Jesuit fathers who saw the settlement of Jews as a battle they had lost did not rest and continued with incessant efforts to rid the island of Jews. On 2nd April 1658, the Sovereign Council of Martinique issued a decree prohibiting the Jews from dealing with commerce on the islands. But due to the intervention of the governor, Seigneur du Parquet, a new decree several months later re-established the privileges given to the Jews to deal with commerce, canceling the previous decree. It should be noted that the Jesuit fathers based themselves in their fight for expulsion of the Jews on Article 4 of the Charter of the Company of the Islands of America, approved by the French king, which states, "No one who is not a citizen and does not follow the Roman Apostolic Catholic religion will be permitted to settle in the islands, colonies, or settlements." And Article 6 of the company's contract with D'Olive and Du Plessis, who captured Guadeloupe, says, "Only French and Catholics can settle." The Jews immediately after settling began to establish commercial houses, sugarcane plantations, and sugar plants on a large scale. This brought a period of prosperity to the impoverished islands and profits to their own owners, Huel and de Parquet. A Catholic priest stationed in Cayenne, in French Guiana, Antoine Biet, describes his dismay upon his visit in Martinique in 1662. It is worthwhile reading his statement in his own words, translated from the French. And this is what they were saying. He was saying, as the Jews owned the main stores and the best choices of merchandise, they were prevented to observe the day of Sabbath, the market day. Therefore, they managed to transfer the weigh-in day, the day of the goods sold, were weighed and checked for tax purposes, and which was also the market day, to Friday. This was agreed by the governor. So the Jews that are not tolerated in France have found in a French island to practice Judaism, and after Friday's sunset until Saturday, in the same hour they rest, do not sell any merchandise to anyone. But they easily profane the day of Holy Sunday and church holidays, selling to a lot of people what they need, and Catholics assemble in their stores. The biggest and most cruel enemies of Jesus Christ, the Jews, whom they crucified, that's the hijack, publicly exercise their religion and keep the Sabbath. The Jews have storehouses in Fort St. Pierre and in the city where vessels anchor. They are the main merchants and have the good graces of M. de Parquet, the governor owner, and his wife. Therefore, all the inhabitants who have prepared sugar, tobacco, ginger, and indigo, and others do not use Saturday for public weighing. The main Jewish contribution to Martinique and Guadeloupe was in agrarian industry. The French islands were relatively late in developing sugar production. It was only after the settlement of the Jews from Brazil, who were experienced sugar refiners and merchants, all right, talking about people of color, that the sugar industry started picking up. In 1661, there were 71 sugar plants in Guadeloupe, with Martinique lagging behind. However, Martinique in 1671 had 111 sugar plants with 6,582 workers and slaves working in them, and by 1685 reached 172 plants. This caused many of the planters to switch from tobacco culture to sugarcane. One of the most prominent sugar producers was Benjamin da Costa, all right, the Costa family, the Costa de Andrade, a Jew born as a converso in Portugal, all right, a Portuguese Jew, very dark complexion, who had settled in Dutch Brazil and had reached Martinique in 1654. He was the owner of two of the largest sugar plants in Martinique. The site is still shown to tourists visiting the island. Da Costa de Andrade is known and remembered as establishing the first cacao processing plant in French territory. Cacao processing was started in Spanish colonies in America, but the processing in Martinique was advanced, modernized, and transformed into chocolate. At first, the chocolate was not well received by the public in France, and the custom duties on it were very high. However, it developed over the years, and by 1684, more and more cacao processing plants were built in Martinique, and chocolate became its most important export. Benjamin de Acosta, however, could not benefit from its development. In 1664, with the growing profits of the Caribbean colonies, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, 1619, 1683, the chief minister of Louis XIV, all right, so-called black man, Louis XIV, swarthy brown complexion man, we got the sources, formed the Compagnie des Indes Occidentales, or the Company of the West Indies, centralized the rights of the colonies, passing them from the seigneurs owners to the direct control of the French crown. According to new company rules, all commerce had to be transferred to French hands and be conducted only with France. Thus, Benjamin de Acosta had to abandon his plans, which had passed into the hands of his French partners. These restrictions also hampered flourishing trade between Martinique and Amsterdam, carried out mainly by Jews on both sides, just like we read in the other book. They had networks, all over the Atlantic. That's how they were able to, be so prosperous. The limitations stemmed mainly from the fact that the Company of the West Indies considered the Jews its competitors. So remember, these companies are all set up by Sephardic Jews too. The Jews' close contact with Amsterdam and the Dutch island of Curaçao led to the diversion of a large part of Martinique's produce to non-French ports, causing a loss to the French treasury. At the same time, the Jewish prosperity was the object of envy by a large section of the French planters in Martinique and Guadeloupe. The Brazilian Jews did not only have the expertise, but also were able to finance their sugar plants, which needed a considerable initial investment. The majority of the French planters continued planting tobacco and gradually became more and more impoverished. Their need for cash indebted them to Jewish money lenders. The Jews were also accused of investing their profits outside Martinique, therefore depriving the islands of their cash liquidity. Thus, a coalition formed by the Jesuit fathers and the French planters and merchants went into action to limit Jewish life and bring about the expulsion of the Jews. The coalition managed to force the hand of Governor Proville de Tracy to issue, in 1664, an act in which a paragraph is included saying, that those of the Jewish nation must purchase and sell on the day of Sabbath, unless otherwise ordered by His Majesty. The unhappy de Tracy wanted clearer instructions from France. He received ambiguous ones, namely, the king does not want to alter what has been practiced till now towards the Huguenots and the Jews, right? Huguenots and the Jews, because they're the same people. De Tracy's only recourse was to close his eyes to the transgressions of his own act. The Jews continued keeping the Sabbath. The nomination in 1667 of de Baz, a person of culture, tolerance, and liberal ideas, as governor led to a positive attitude toward the Jews. In a short time, de Baz became convinced that the Jewish presence was very necessary for the welfare of the islands, especially through their plantations and industries. His nomination encouraged the Jews to make a direct appeal to Louis XIV, conducted by 3 relatives of Martinique Jews in Amsterdam, to act officially for commerce rights equal to those of the other inhabitants of the islands. Undoubtedly, the petitioners had coordinated the petition with Governor de Baz, who gave it a positive recommendation to the petition. This resulted in the letter of 23 May 1671, signed by Louis XIV and co-signed by the Chief Minister Colbert, as follows. M. de Baz, being informed that the Jews established in Martinique and other islands have invested considerably for the tilling of the land and fortifying their establishments for the public utility, by this letter I inform that my intention is that you take care that they have the same privileges as the inhabitants of the said islands, and you allow them complete liberty of conscience, but taking the necessary precautions so that the exercise of their religion will not scandalize the Catholics. All right, that was translated from the French. From this letter, the Jews deduced that they could practice their religion on condition that they do not do so openly. This encouraged them to ask the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam for a Bible scroll, Torah, which was received in 1676 by Benjamin de Acosta de Andrade. The Jews of Martinique read the king's letter well. Further proof of its meaning appears in the diary for 1671 of the French king's emissary to the French colony of Cayenne, Lefebvre de la Barre, 1671, in which he writes, "The practice of the sole religion permitted in the islands is a Catholic one. Although there are some inhabitants of the religion pretending to be reformists, and also some declared Jews in Martinique, they are not permitted to have any public manifestation of their religion." Translated from the French again. Theories have been put forward that a synagogue existed in Martinique. The several possible sites have been indicated. However, the prayers were supposedly conducted in a private house, transformed into a prayer house, which gradually became an improvised synagogue. The happy and quiet Jewish existence of the Martinique Jews continued until the death of Governor de Baz in 1677. His replacement, Count de Blanac, a devotee of the Jesuits, had served as confessor of Louis XIV. His main aim was the expulsion of the Jews from Martinique. He constantly appealed to the court to take measures against the Jews. The result of his efforts had their ups and downs. His own intendant of the island, Began, and some of his functionaries opposed him. Contradicting reports about the Jews reached Versailles. Colbert himself did not want to change the status quo. A petition instigated by de Blanac was presented to Colbert by the Jesuit fathers of the island in 1681. In the petition, the Jews were accused of having Christian slaves, of blaspheming the name of Jesus, of killing the babies born to their Christian slaves so that they should not be baptized, of observing openly the Sabbath, Passover, and other Jewish holidays, of circumcising their newborn males, of preparing their meat according to Jewish laws, and so on. The petition recommended that Jews be tolerated only for commercial purposes. that they be distinguished from others by a special outward sign, that no Jew be permitted to arrive in Martinique with the intention of settling, no permission be given to Jews to own slaves, and no Jews who had been baptized and returned to Judaism be permitted to stay on the island. Seeing the incitement against them, the Jews of Martinique began gradually to abandon the island. Guadeloupe, with its history replete with upheavals, saw its Jewish population diminishing drastically. When Count de Blenac was on leave in France in 1683, he found Colbert in a bad health, and using his personal contacts in the French court, managed to obtain the king's signature on the order for the Jews' expulsion from the islands, with a letter confirming the receipt of the Jesuits' petition. To be certain that the order would be executed without delay, the king signed the Black Code, Code Noir, in 1685, guys, and I've broken this down. I got a whole video on this. The Black Codes, the ones they say are for so-called African slaves and all that, that was for Sephardic Jews and Muslims in the Caribbean first. That was made for them. That's just telling you right here. Okay, based on the Jesuit petition to be certain that the order would be executed without delay, the king signed the Black Code, or Code Noir, in 1685. In paragraph 1, the document states, in order to be implemented in our islands, ordering all of our officers to chase out our islands all the Jews who are residing there, and to leave in 3 months, time from the publication of the present, any punishment of confiscation of all property for non-compliance. All right, again, this was in regards to the crypto Jews and Muslims, not African slaves. The Black Codes originally was for them, guys. All right, we've already shown the source on other videos. There are different estimates of how many Jews were in Martinique at the time of the expulsion and the Code Noir, or the Black Code. It is estimated that they numbered less than 100, estimated, including the families Pereira, all right, which a lot of them became Perry, Pereira, Franco, Atias, Molina, Letov, Barhuda, Pinheiro, de Andrade, Lewis, de Gama, Bueno, Cohen, Lopez, Gabay, Israel, da Costa, de Andrade, Vaz, and Nunez. Most of the Jews left Martinique for Curaçao. The historian of Curaçao and its chief rabbi, Isaac Emmanuel, has identified the families Vaz, Andrade, de Molina, da Gama, Franco Atias, Pinheiro, Pereira, da Costa, de Andrade, residing in Curaçao. I remember we just read Curaçao was a major spot for where they were, and they were open to practice their Judaism there. They had a lot of synagogues and everything, and we've gone over that again in past videos as well. The Bible scroll Torah, together with the ornaments of the improvised synagogue, were taken off the island by those expelled. There remain some sites there related to Jewish presence in 17th century Martinique, ruins of sugar mills, mansions, and so on, particularly in the so-called Old Brazilian Quarter. A Guadalupe legend still tells of a Jewish fisherman named Pieters, who started a fishing business on a point on the coast after arriving from Brazil. Under the British occupation in 1759, a city was founded named Point of Pitre, on the same spot of the Point of Pieters. The Black Code was the subject of various interpretations. Some said that it concerned only Jews who were not French citizens, and not all the Jews, all right? Again, what was the Black Codes for? Come on, this is major right here. If you are new to my channel, you think Black Codes was in reference to African slaves or just black people in general, it was specifically started for the crypto Jews, the crypto Muslims in the Caribbean, and then that was brought, same things were brought to the States. So they're saying it might have been only the Jews who were not French citizens and not all Jews. In other instances, it was deduced that Jews could travel to the islands but not reside in them, based on the lettres patentes signed by the French kings. A question was also raised if the Portuguese Jews residing in France could be denied residence in the French colonies. Most of those questions remained open to the different interpretations, and decisions of local magistrates. We can quote two cases concerning Martinique. The Jacobin father, Jean-Baptiste Labat, describes the arrival in Martinique in 1699 of a member of Benjamin de Acosta de Andrade family who had come from Curaçao to arrange for debts due his relative, which he had inherited. The industries were taken over by Da Costa's Christian partners. The visit yielded no results. Payment was refused. However, from this very visit itself, as well as from others we are aware of, we may conclude that visits were possible. As for residence, it depended on the connections to the authorities. David Gradis, a Portuguese Jew from Bordeaux, founded one of the largest companies dealing with the French colonies and had obtained permission to have his two nephews, Mendez and Miranda, reside in Martinique. The company was an important one, and about 6 of the company's ships arrived in Martinique every year. And one of those ships came Samuel Gradis, the son of David, who died in Martinique in January 1732. He was buried in a monastery, Freres de la Charite, with all the appropriate Jewish prayers, but without a tombstone marking his grave. Wow. This allows us to deduce that in 1732, there were at least 10 Jews residing in Martinique, so as to form a minyan, the prayer quorum of 10 Jewish males for a Jewish burial. By the time of the French Revolution, there was, for all practical purposes, no serious Jewish presence in Martinique or Guadeloupe, all right? So that means, they weren't making an impact. There was still some left over there, of course. A lot of people had already forgotten or converted to Catholicism and left their Jewish heritage behind, mixed with Indians, mixed with other Europeans, and they have forgotten even their ethnicity or just left it in the dark, all right? So about, 1730s is when, we don't hear about them supposedly anymore. All right, so that was the end of that chapter about Martinique and Guadeloupe, the French colonies in the Caribbean, the Jewish nation, so-called Jewish Sephardic, crypto Jews, Marranos, Moriscos, all these people settle in there. All right, next chapter is on the city or town Cayenne in French Guiana. We'll go ahead and get that on another installment. So that was the dismount, guys. As you guys can see, they played a very prominent role in colonial times. And again, these were people of color. These were people of color. Again, this was the book, The Jewish Nation of the Caribbean, the Spanish-Portuguese Jewish Settlements in the Caribbean and the Guyanas. And we also, read the other book, Atlantic Diaspora, the Jews, Conversos, and Crypto Jews in the Age of Mercantilism. All right, this is the book right here, 1500 to 1800. And I hope you enjoyed the reading. We'll get more and more into some other books we have on them. Thank you for taking the time to hear me read this to you. Just trying to get back into the investigation with the history that's left out of these people of color, right? These so-called black folks, these crypto Jews, these crypto Muslims, Marranos, Moriscos, that they, kind of downplayed the history to us. They don't really teach about this. They really leave out a lot of context, all right? So I thought we'd just get back into it. Again, thanks for being here, taking the time out of your day to come listen to me, and all the way to the end of the video, me read all these books, all right? I appreciate you guys taking the time to do that. Much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Wow.